thank you, Duncan, for inviting me to come and speak here. I'm from the School of Informatics at Edinburgh University, and I'm going to present to you the Palimpsest project, which was basically about mining Edinburgh's literary history, and I'll tell you all about it as I go through my presentation. But first of all, I'll tell you who was all involved in it. So this was an AHRC-funded project under the Big Data scheme, and it completed in March this year. And the partners involved were foremost the literary scholars at the University of Edinburgh. So the PI was James Loxley, and then there was a group in my school working mainly on the text mining side of the project at the School of Informatics, and also some visualization experts at the Sachi Lab at St.Andrews University, and also people at Edina helping us with our social media presence and also managing our database. So just to start with, Palimpsest was the brainchild of Miranda Anderson. She's a research fellow at Edinburgh University. And she, a few years ago, wanted to create some kind of interface that allows you to walk through Edinburgh and see excerpts from books that are set in Edinburgh and explore the city via its literature, basically. And so she had a project with an MSc student based at Informatics to kind of come up with some pilot interfaces. And you can see a screenshot here on the screen. But it was a very kind of early stage. And so the idea of our project was to scale it up, increase the data size, and also automate some of the steps involved in this. She collected a few hundred excerpts manually by basically crowdsourcing, by emailing her colleagues and asking for some entries. And we wanted to kind of scale this up by a lot, basically. And so the research questions we had were, first of all, how can we identify a book that is set in Edinburgh? What is an Edinburgh book, basically? And how can we automatically identify them? And then from our point of view, we are interested in georeferencing text, so that is identifying locations within text and grounding them to latitude and longitudes. And normally we work on a kind of higher level of locations. So for example, Edinburgh would be the sort of lowest we would go down in other projects. But in this case, we wanted to kind of go much further into the city. So we wanted to do fine-grained georeferencing. And then from a visualization perspective, the questions were how to build interfaces that can kind of meet the needs of both scholars who are interested in literature and place in literature, but also the general public and non-scholarly audiences who want to just find out what authors, where they set their books, if they set anything in their street, for example. So here's an excerpt of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You might not have expected to be to contain an Edinburgh setting, but there you can see a few place names that from Edinburgh: Arthur's Seat, Pentland Hills, St. Bernard's Well. And so we decided to, even though the majority of the book isn't set in Edinburgh, include books like that, as long as there were at least some kind of description of places within Edinburgh contained in the book. Here's something slightly more obvious, the picturesque notes from Robert Louis Stevenson. And there we've got a couple of locations like the toll booth, which is a place that no longer exists. It was part of the Lucken booths on the Royal Mile, and also Heart of Midlothian. So you can see some of the issues we had to deal with in terms of locations that have either disappeared over time or have moved over time. And that's an excerpt from Irvine Welsh. So we also contain some more contemporary books, basically, with permission from publishers. Here you can see that while the language is very flowery, the actual location names, have remained in their common form, which we were kind of relieved about. This is the Palimpsest workflow. So the idea was to take all of the accessible literature, at least accessible to us, literature in, and then do some document retrieval, which means to kind of identify literature that automatically using a computer and then rank them based on different methods that kind of consider metadata and subject information if that was available, and also obviously the locations contained within the books. And then we fed that ranking into a curation tool, which was presented to our literary scholars, who then went through the ranked list, which was a much smaller subset of the initial data sets. And they then said, yes, this is definitely one that we want to contain into our final data set, or this isn't. And then our tools came in again, where we then text mined the final data set of, I think, 550 books in the end, to then identify the exact locations and pinpoint them to the map and extract snippets around them. And all of the information is stored in a database, which then sits at the back end of a couple of user interfaces. So really the idea was to go from big data to a small data. So taking all of the accessible literature, but then drilling it down to a few hundred books that are actually set in Edinburgh. So the data sets that we kind of took in at the beginning are listed here. There's the Hadley Trust collection. We used all of the worldwide public domain material from them. We used the British Library 19th Century Books collection, the English Project Gutenberg books, the Oxford Text Archive, and also some books from the National Library of Scotland. And then, as I said, some contemporary works from authors where we got permission. I think in total they made up something like 380,000 titles. And in terms of the text analysis tasks, we, as I said, had to first retrieve and rank the items, and then once we had the final data set, do the georeferencing on the texts and identify the locations within the text. And then after that, we extracted the snippets around these locations and also ranked the snippets per document by a measure of interestingness, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And then at the end, we also had a few duplicates, so we helped the literary scholars in trying to identify possible duplication in the set. So the document retrieval really started with taking an index of each of the collections and then basically retrieving candidates that were then presented to the literary scholars who went through them manually. And we had an initial kind of pilot phase where they gave us feedback on the ranking, which we then used to improve our methods. And that's published in Digital Humanities 2015, which was just in July, back a few months ago. If you're interested in those results, you can have a look at that. Here we've got a screenshot of the actual curation tool. So you can see on the left-hand panel are the different works, and then on the right-hand side is the text, the snippets containing the locations, and also a graph of where in the book these locations appear, and then at the top the curators were able to decide whether or not they wanted to include the book or not. The scheme they used was had 5 different categories. The ones that they did include were basically fiction containing Edinburgh place names, and then they wanted to make a distinction between that and narrative non-fiction, so narrative, travel literature, and memoirs, and so on, that also contained Edinburgh place names. The other categories they didn't want to include. The last one is obviously literature not containing Edinburgh place names that were accidentally picked up, because sometimes you can have several occurrences of a place name appearing all over the world, and while our aim is to kind of optimize the performance on disambiguating between them, it doesn't always work 100% accurately. One of the aims was, because we were looking at such a broad spectrum of literature from the start, was to kind of be able to identify some gems that literary scholars didn't necessarily know when they were asked, give me some books that contain Edinburgh place names. And so while they were going through the ranked output and doing the curation, they did actually find a few examples of things that they didn't expect. So that was kind of nice for us that this worked out. And this is a graph from Ted Underwood's blog on genre identification. So in the document retrieval task, sometimes we were able to rely on that information present in the metadata, and that really helped to kind of exclude types of genre that we were definitely not interested in. For example, here he has a graph of 4 different types, like ads, drama, poetry, and fiction. So knowing this kind of information is obviously really useful, and he published a method of how to do that automatically at the beginning of this year, and having been able to use this at the start of the project would really have helped, because the curators said one of the difficult things in the automatic retrieval really was to distinguish between genre. So one of the things we specialize in is georeferencing, and to do that you need gazetteer. So that is basically a list of locations with latitude and longitudes assigned to them, so that you can then basically try and distinguish when a location appears within the text, which one it is. And for this project, we didn't have an available resource, so what we had to do is basically create one, and we did that by aggregating information from different resources, including OpenStreetMap, OS Locator, information from the Royal Commission of Ancient Historic Monuments of Scotland, and also some shapes of Edinburgh areas. And of course, they all come in different formats and have different structures and different information stored. So some of the time at the beginning of the project was spent to kind of standardize that into one format that we could use, and extracted the same type of information from each of the different data sets for the gazetteer. And then in terms of the actual georeferencing, we spent a lot of time doing fine-tuning of the outputs. So here we have quite a nice excerpt from John Wilson's The Recreation of Christopher North about Edinburgh, and here it is displayed in our in-house visualization, which we use to then do error analysis to check, did we get this right? Do we, are there errors? Are there consistent errors that we can fix, and so on. I said already I would talk a little bit about interestingness. So once we had actually extracted the different excerpts containing the locations for a book, some books obviously had like quite a lot of excerpts and some only had a few, but for those for which we had quite a lot, some of the excerpts weren't actually that interesting. So they were just random mentions of a location, maybe within like within a bit of spoken dialogue, which wasn't really that interesting. So what we wanted to do is kind of make those snippets that had more kind of flower language or a more description of the city to kind of turn up to the top of the ranking, so that people using the interface would see those first. And these are 2 snippets from Jane Alexander's Candlemaker Row, where you can see that we compute this I-score, the interestingness score, basically, using different features like, has it got adjectives in it, how long is it, how many locations are in it, and so on, to be able to distinguish between snippets that potentially are more interesting than others. Just as a side, this Candlemaker Row is a short story that won the writers' competition that was run as part of the project. And if you're interested in Edinburgh, it's a really nice piece of literature. So then user interfaces. And these are 2 people that were hired by the project for our kind of outreach activities, dressed up as Walter Scott and Margaret Oliphant, and they're holding the iPad with our interfaces on them for the launch of the project outputs. We created, first of all, a web interface, and this is available at litlong.org, and you can play with it yourself at your own leisure. You can see that the main way into the data is via a map. You can zoom into that and see the excerpts as you zoom in. You can see keywords within the excerpts or other locations surrounding specific locations in the cluster. On the right-hand side, you can see all the different books that are in our data set, and then you can limit that by author or by location or by keyword. And at the bottom is the timeline of the publication date. You can also link back to the original source documents for each of the books. Then we also developed a mobile app, which basically has the same data underlying with slightly simplified kind of functionalities, where you can walk through the city and see what excerpts are around you, but also move around the map to kind of discover other excerpts. So just to summarize, I presented to you a project about mainly assisted curation of literary works set in Edinburgh. Really the aim was to keep the literary scholars in the loop while we did our technical development, and their feedback really helped to improve our technology. The method of assisted curation helped us to scan all accessible literature, and that meant that we had a broad coverage, but at the same time, having their manual checking then allowed us to have a very precise final data set in the end. Yeah, and I will talk to you about genre classification, and that, having that kind of metadata information is very useful. In terms of this text analysis work, apart from the things I presented, there were other steps involved. So there's spent quite a lot of time on data preparation. I talked about the retrieval and the gazetteer creation and the cleaning, the georeferencing and the fine-tuning and computing of snippet interestingness. But we also had to deal with some of the OCR quality, because dealing with historical data sets, the OCR is not always what you would like it to be. So this is optical character recognition, you probably know. And also we did some of the deduplication. And then from a visualization point of view, which is not my specialty, really the task was to create interfaces which can meet the needs both of scholars and non-specialist audiences. The outputs, I already mentioned, some are basically available through the litlong.org site. There's the web-based visualization, the mobile app. There's also an API to search the data directly, if you would like. And we also have made available a Scottified, as in Walter Scottified version of LitLong for his birthday, which was, I think, on the 15th of August and presented at the Edinburgh Book Festival. And then we also provide code and data that we can release on GitHub. Finally, the group I'm working in is the Edinburgh Language Technology Group. Apart from Palimpsest, we work on many different types of projects. So we've worked on a project similar to the one that Guy presented on social media analysis for the British Council, which was called UK Connectivity. We work on processing CVs, work on botanical data, in tech historical data sets on commodity trading for trading consequences, and at the moment we are busy with a project on brain scan reports that go along with brain scan images. So you can see there's a big range of domains, and our speciality is trying to adapt the text mining to the various different fields. And that's the end of my talk.
Great, thanks very much. Do we have any questions for Bea? There's one at the front here.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was very interesting. There was a lot of automated stuff, but there seemed to be a lot of non-automated stuff. So if I wanted to replicate that for the beautiful city of Canterbury, where I'm from, how much effort would it take?
Quite a lot, I would say. I mean, like the literary scholars spend quite a lot of time on trying to decide what literature would actually make it into the final data set. But I mean, we have obviously learned a lot doing the project, so it wouldn't take as long as what we ended up spending. So, and our methods are described. So, and we are happy to share our methods with other scholars, so that people can reuse the same ideas or even technology if they like.
So, can I ask the sort of person months involved? Obviously, it would be less, but that would give me an upper limit.
So the project was 15 months. Which for us is quite short, to be honest. I don't know how I'm not sure how to estimate. I'm sorry, it's like how long is a piece of string? I think it depends on the size of the city, the amount of data you have, and things like that, yes. Sorry, less than 50 months.
Any other questions? One over there on the left.
Hi, great presentation.
Thank you.
You focused, for obvious reasons, on historic sources of books. Would it be possible to do this for contemporary works that are being written about, that involve Edinburgh at the moment?
Yeah, so I've mentioned that we've included a few. The reason it's only a few is because we didn't have enough time to contact every publisher, get permission. You know, each of the works comes in a different format. At least with the 5 collections we had of non-copyrighted material, they were all at least within each collection in the same format. So the amount of work of bringing each of the formats from the various books into the same format that we need would have taken too long. But having said that, we are really interested in people adding their books to this system now. So yes, so there's one very famous author which wasn't on the list, who didn't, whose publisher wasn't too keen on having his works included, at least not for free. But now, you know, we are like kind of suggesting and encouraging people to kind of add their works kind of afterwards, basically. But doing that on a large scale, obviously, it would be very time-consuming. Yeah.
Right, I think there's one more question just here.
Of course, if we said, you know, if you're submitting it in this format and, you know, in that way, then that could be speeded up. So.
For Society of Edinburgh. I just want interested in your category of interestingness. I mean, that's very subjective.
I know.
I mean, somebody might find something fascinating, and other thing might totally boring. How did you? I know you sort of use of adjectives and stuff, but how did you define that?
We just used very like a few broad features. We didn't even have actually time to evaluate the quality of the ranking there. It was just really to be able to make some of the really short and kind of passing passages appear further down in the interface, but they're not kind of missing, right? They're still there. And that's actually one of the fields we want to look at more. It's kind of really related to relevance of results for search engines and things like that. So yeah, we are really interested in that side of the research. Yeah.
Great, I think let's move on to our final speaker. So thanks very much, Bea.